Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring one of the most captivating and honestly downright terrifying figures in all of ancient Egyptian mythology. We're talking about the goddess Sekhmet. Her story isn't just some dusty old myth either. It's practically a masterclass in how the ancient world understood this incredibly delicate balance between absolute, world-ending chaos and profound healing. Okay, let's dive into this.
I want you to genuinely stop and consider this for a second. How do you actually stop a goddess who has literally been unleashed to wipe out humanity, right? It sounds exactly like the plot of some summer blockbuster, but this was a very real, thrilling tension right at the heart of Egyptian mythology. As we go through the source material today, we're going to uncover a crazy story of divine wrath, a genuinely brilliant deception, and a completely absurd resolution that supposedly saved all of human existence.
To understand how things got pushed right to the brink of the apocalypse, we need to kick things off with Section 1, the Eye of Ra.
So Sekhmet, whose name in ancient Egyptian actually translates to power or the mighty one, was this absolute powerhouse of a warrior goddess. She was the daughter of the sun god Ra and was recognized as a massive solar deity in her own right. If you were to walk through an ancient Egyptian temple, you'd instantly recognize her. She's famously depicted with the head of a fierce lioness, topped with this large sun disk in the uraeus, which is that sacred rearing cobra. And these aren't just aesthetic choices. Those intimidating feline features and solar symbols are telegraphing her intense, radiant power and her incredibly high status within the whole pantheon.
So, the crucial point is this fascinating dichotomy. This is really the core focus of our explainer today. You see, Sekhmet wasn't just a one-note character. On one hand, she was literally the bringer of plagues, the physical embodiment of divine vengeance. But then, on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, she was this deeply revered healer of the sick and a patron goddess of medicine. She embodied both absolute destruction and restorative healing. You literally couldn't have one without the other.
Let's start by looking at the much darker side of that duality in Section 2, the vengeful destroyer.
Just imagine, for a moment, that you're living in ancient Egypt, facing the incredibly harsh, unforgiving desert. The ancient Egyptians actually personified those very real environmental threats through Sekhmet. She acted as the Eye of Ra, basically the vengeful manifestation of the sun god's raw, unfiltered power. So when those hot, scorching winds suddenly blew in from the desert, the Egyptians believed that was literally Sekhmet breathing fire. And when devastating diseases suddenly swept through a town, well, those plagues were described as her personal servants, her messengers. She held the power of nature's absolute most terrifying elements right in the palm of her hand.
Which brings us to the most famous myth about her. According to the texts, there was a time when humans grew arrogant. They started conspiring against Ra's rule on Earth. So, in response, Ra sends down the goddess Hathor, transforming her into the fierce, unstoppable form of Sekhmet to basically annihilate these rebellious mortals. She descends upon humanity, but, and here's the massive problem, her bloodlust wasn't quenched when the battle ended, not even close. She went on this completely uncontrolled bloody rampage that laid absolute waste to Egypt. She was literally on the verge of wiping out all of humanity, and she was entirely out of Ra's control.
So humanity is literally about to go extinct, which naturally leads us to Section 3, the Lake of Red Beer.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer, undeniable absurdity of the gods' master plan. They knew they couldn't stop her with brute force, right? So they had to rely on trickery. Step 1, they brew this massive amount of beer, like literally enough to fill an entire lake. Step 2, they dye this enormous lake of beer with red ochre so that it perfectly resembles a giant, inviting pool of human blood. And step 3, they just place it right in her warpath and wait. It's an incredibly practical, albeit ridiculous, step-by-step divine intervention.
And you know what? The trick worked flawlessly. Sekhmet comes charging along, sees this red lake, totally mistakes the dyed beer for human blood, and just drinks the entire thing. She became so heavily intoxicated that she completely forgot all about her murderous rampage. She just falls asleep, abandons the slaughter, and eventually wakes up with a massive hangover, returning peacefully to Ra. So yeah, through a state of extreme divine drunkenness, the entire world was basically saved from total annihilation.
Now, this pacification of Sekhmet isn't just some funny punchline to a myth. It permanently alters her role in the Egyptian pantheon, bringing us nicely to Section 4, Goddess of Medicine.
Because she was finally pacified, her entire relationship with humanity shifted. The ancient Egyptians knew she was the master of plagues and those scorching desert winds, so the irony here is actually perfectly logical. To protect yourself against disease, you've got to appeal to the very goddess who controls those diseases. It makes sense, right?
She was transformed from this ruthless, bloodthirsty destroyer into a profoundly vital healer, becoming a central, highly protective figure in Egyptian medicine. In fact, her priests were often the primary physicians of the time. And the sheer scale of her worship as this protective figure was absolutely staggering. I mean, just consider this number for a second. 700. During the New Kingdom, around 700, and honestly some scholars suggest it was significantly more, statues of Sekhmet were constructed for the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III alone. That is wild. While she might have been a comparatively minor figure back in the Old Kingdom, by the time of the New Kingdom, her protective presence was required on a massive, almost industrial scale.
But her influence went way beyond just carving statues and practicing early medicine. Let's look at how this mythological duality directly impacted real-world Egyptian culture in Section 5, the Festival of Intoxication.
Let's move to and see how this builds from the mythology into actual boots-on-the-ground historical practice. Every single year, right at the beginning of the year, the ancient Egyptians threw this incredible, massive party called the Festival of Intoxication. To honor Sekhmet and make absolutely sure she stayed peaceful, the people would actively recreate the myth of the red beer. They danced, they played music to soothe her wildness, and they ritually drank massive quantities of beer and wine to imitate the extreme drunkenness that originally stopped her wrath. They were literally partying to keep the apocalypse at bay.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how seriously they took these festivals. Back in 2006, archaeologist Betsy Bryant from Johns Hopkins University presented these amazing findings from her excavations at the Temple of Mut in Luxor. She found concrete, physical evidence of these massive festivals, including historical records showing tens of thousands of people attending. They even found a dedicated porch of drunkenness, built by the famous pharaoh Hatshepsut. The illustrations showed priestesses being served alcohol to total excess, with temple attendants actively ministering to them when, the adverse effects kicked in. It was a highly organized, state-sponsored ritual of getting completely wasted.
The sheer volume of her statues and the absolute intensity of her worship mean that today, this lion-headed goddess is actually the most physically represented Egyptian deity in museum collections worldwide. But her legacy isn't just carved in stone. Her profound duality, the destroyer who also heals, really continues to resonate. Even today, she is actively worshipped by some modern pagans, particularly those who follow goddess spirituality. It just goes to show that her powerful, dual nature still commands deep reverence thousands of years later.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Sekhmet represented the awe-inspiring, frankly terrifying power of nature, and the delicate balance required to actually survive it. When you look at our world today, what modern forces demand this exact same respect? Where do we still see that line blurring between absolute destruction and restorative healing? It's definitely something to chew on the next time you see a lioness, or, perhaps the next time you raise a glass. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.